Welcome in, people. Time for us to go through how to do more damage in general. We're going to go from a very early stage and then give you some pointers for what to do once you get into some of the harder encounters in the game. And the first thing I want to do is just show you guys how to get into the testing arena. In case you guys don't know, if we go to a relay, I believe he's in the strategy relay as well, and we go and visit Cephalon Sumaris. In case you don't know, if you bring up your options menu, you'll have fast travel. We can go visit Cephalon Sumaris. You'll have to do some work for him. But over in the offerings tab here, you'll find we have simulacrum key, 50,000. Doesn't take too long to get this built up, actually. And once you have this, we are now able to enter into the simulacrum itself. It's worth knowing this so that you can test out whatever it is that you want to do. We can come over to the panel right here and put whatever we want in front of us. Now, I'm just going to go with some standard level 90 enemies to start with, just so that I'm able to show what we're talking about as we progress through modding the weapon, and then move on to creating a loadout. You can mod the weapon individually, yes, and then you can mod the Warframe individually as well. But I don't think many people use the loadout system very well, or mention it in that way. We'll look at that towards the back end of the video. But anyway, let's just go and fire at one of these guys, and we're going to see my base level bolter here is like trying to hit it with tissue paper. It's just not doing anything. Now, of course, I've got some Warframe abilities that can help with that, but for now, I want to go through what we can do with the weapon to improve what it's doing. The first thing that I need to draw your attention to is the damage type of the weapon, and you're looking for the majority damage type, because this is what your status is also going to be based on as well. And if you just hover over it, you'll see which enemies are weaker to this enemy type. This is why I've selected Corpus in my particular demonstration here. If you are earlier on in the game, you're making your way through the star chart, just having the knowledge that different damage type is going to increase your damage immediately by 50%, 1.5x, and that's going to be everything that affects your puncture damage. That's already going to give you a fairly big head start and make the first few planets, at the very least, a lot easier. Now, of course, boosting this with mods, some of this is obvious, some of this isn't. I want to talk about addative versus multiplicative to start with. Any mod that we put on here is going to be based on the base damage of the weapon. What that means is I put serration on here. That has just multiplied my damage here by 165% because there was nothing else on here. I'm sure everybody's with me so far. Now, if I put heavy caliber on here, that is only going to do the same amount of damage again as we already did with serration. So we have doubled up the damage that we've gotten from serration, but as a percentage of our total damage, that's actually a lower benefit. Whereas if I put cryo on here, and this is elemental damage, again, this is going to be based off of my total physical damage. Instead, we're going to see that this number goes much higher. So that's 323. I didn't check this. That's 197. So you can see there's a huge disparity here when we put an elemental weapon on there. You should generally aim to do, especially as you're just starting to put mods on your weapon, is get damage from different sources, which means you see all of these lines right here. These are effectively different sources of damage, and you should try and modify each of these once first. That should be the order you do things in. So for example, we put serration on, put cryo rounds on, so we've got an elemental and we've got a base damage mod on there, and that is giving us a pretty big return. After that, we also have a thing called multi-shot. We don't actually have a line for it right here because it only fires one shot each time we pull the trigger. But if I put split chamber on here, you'll find we now have a multi-shot stat, and that's gone to 1.9, which means 90% of the time we fire an extra shot. So that might as well be as close to double damage as you want to get it. At this kind of point then, you might want to look at the different elemental damage that we can also inflict. And being as we're turning this into an anti-corpus weapon, we need to worry about shields, which means with this cryo damage, if we add some electric damage to this, that's going to turn into magnetic damage. Now, in case you didn't see, this is going to mean that we basically do more damage against shields. And because, again, we are aiming to be attacking corpus, you may also want to put something like infected clip on, as this can actually bypass the shield. Now, I'm going to take this one off because I want to make sure this is fair. We're not actually going to use the primed one, but I just wanted to show that in action with the same percentage as the serration. We're in a state now where we have boosted the damage of the weapon pretty good, and we've selected the correct damage types that are going to be nasty to corpus. So let's go and see what happens now when I go and fire at this guy. Let's see if I still hit like a wet noodle. So now if I shoot this guy, we're actually putting him down. It's not perfect, but we're looking pretty good. And we haven't even filled the weapon yet. Now, I'm probably not going to fill this because I haven't got too many former on the bolter prime, but I wanted to use the bolter weapon specifically because you get given this quite early in the game. And so although this is going to be slightly higher, once you've gotten the bolter, you can do something similar with your own weapon of this type. So of course, another way to improve the damage per second of this game, which won't be damage per shot, is to use something that increases fire rate. And I also count punch through as an increase in your damage as well, because that means when you fire a weapon at the guy at the front, it's going to hit the guy at the back, and that means that we do a lot more damage. And just so that people are aware, a Bane mod, so Bane of Corpus, for example, here, is 1.3 times the damage of everything on your weapon. So whilst a 30% damage increase doesn't sound huge, that is a 30% damage increase of that 857 that we currently have at the end of our damage total that we can see on here. If we go and have another crack at these guys now, they're just going to fly down very quickly. Now, of course, this does mean having a configuration or loadout for the enemy that it is that you are facing off against. So I just want to draw your eyes to this top layer here, which is what I think most people miss. And I am very guilty of it, as you can see here. I barely ever use it. I always just kind of change my loadout before a mission. But realistically, it's good to have a loadout set for each enemy type, so you don't need to come and switch everything around every time that you are either changing the warframe that you want to use, or changing for the mission, or changing enemy type that it is that you're fighting. You should realistically fill in your loadout slots so that you can just switch nice and easy to something else and you are good to go. Once we get further into the game, so this is once you're getting towards the back end of the star chart, I think the last status mods, so there are a set of mods which a lot of people will call something different. They're status mods or 60/60 mods, which are these mods right here. You can see they don't cost very much to put on your weapon, and they give you 60% of a element and 60% additional status chance. Once you're at the kind of point where you're getting stuff like this, and you should indeed also be going for the corrupted mods on Demos, we are now getting into the territory where we need to decide whether or not the weapon we're using is a status weapon or whether it's going to be a crit weapon. There is a mild difference between the two because obviously we're going to mod for them specifically, and you may decide to use them in a different way. So for example, this is clearly a status weapon over a crit weapon. You can see 12% crit chance is not very much for us to work with, and it doesn't have a particularly big crit damage modifier. So even if we decide, oh, it's got a low crit chance, but it's got a high crit damage modifier, there is a weapon like this. I'll touch on it in a bit. We don't really want to be modding for this. Instead, it's obviously going to be better to mod for status. And the reason we want to care about this is because once we get towards the back end of the game, we're going to start seeing things like these galvanized mods. Now, I'm going to avoid putting prime mods on things in this video because they're not always available, which also means because the best Bane mods are prime mods, I'm going to call that a reasonable casualty for now as we continue moving forward. If it's going to be a status weapon, a good thing that we can do right here is we can do something like put on galvanized aptitude. So in case you don't know, you get this from arbitrations. Like I said, this is the back end of the game, but this is going to give you 40% additional damage for each status on an enemy when you kill them, and we can do this twice. This is a massive damage boost if you are using a status weapon. And it also means the more damage types you have on there to inflict a status with, the better that's going to do. If we're at the point where we can use galvanized aptitude, we should probably put galvanized split chamber on there as well. This is a similar story, so it's 10% less on base, but you can see that we can add up to an extra 150% to that, which basically means as we're running through missions and we are chaining destroying enemies, that is just going to ramp up the damage that you're going to see as you start defeating enemies going through a mission. And if we are deciding that this is going to be a status weapon, it's also then worth filling in any gaps that we have with at least a couple 60/60 mods or something that gives you an additional status type, because that is effectively more damage just for putting something like that on. Now, I don't want to go and start formering this, but just so we can see how this is going to look, let's go ahead and go against a fresh set of enemies and see how we're looking now as a weapon on its own against something like this. And you'll see up in the top right, I have a selection of status that are building up on the weapon, and we are just nailing these enemies faster and faster as we maintain our destruction of their health bars. Now, you might have seen that I did a lot of reloading there. Something that you may also want to consider, and something that I call a bit of a trade-off, is whether or not the increased amount of reloads is worth the fire rate to you. This can also be turned into more raw damage. So in our case, I could choose to put magnetic capacity on there and radiated reload for a little bit more damage, But most importantly, we have an additional status effect, and we've increased the amount of magnetic damage, which means that is now the most likely status that is going to get put on an enemy. Let's go and have a play, see how that feels. And as you can see, I'm still killing enemies just as quickly, even though my fire rate is not as fast as it was. And I can do all of these now in one magazine, which is much better ammunition economy and allows us to stay in the fight for a lot longer. And I personally think it feels better when that's how the weapon works. We can also get some good damage returns from your arcanes. Now, you may not have this unlocked yet. This is, again, towards the back end of the game, and you'll need to have Steel Path available, as if you don't want to spend platinum on unlocking this, you will need to be able to get Steel Essence, which is what we get from those missions. And there are a good selection of things that we can do in here. One of the most popular ones is primarily Merciless, because it's fairly flexible, can be used on almost any weapon. But when you're being quite specific, like we are, and we are doing toxin procs on our enemies, you may opt to go for something a bit more specific. So in our case, we can decide that because we're doing toxin status effects, that we get more crit damage and more multi-shot. So the crit damage isn't going to do all that much for us, although that is a pretty big increase. The additional multi-shot may do something, but overall probably isn't worth it for us because we are not going to be looking for those crits. So we will in fact put primarily Merciless on there, which is effectively an extra serration mod in our case, because that's going to allow us to get all the way up to 240% additional damage as we are defeating enemies. And this is what a finished weapon might look like, apart from the fact that I haven't unlocked an Excellus weapon adapter, which most people just use for either something like a velocity, so in Bolter's case, because it's not a hit scan weapon, you can speed up the rounds as they go forward, or you may opt to do something like pick up more ammunition, so that if you are using a mod, that means that you fire rounds faster, you'll be able to pick more ammunition up, thereby meaning you're less likely to run out of ammunition. When it comes to a crit weapon then, we have a few different considerations. You're still going to want your raw damage, so things like primed cryo rounds are still going to be on a lot of weapons, but we may do something a little bit different because this isn't really going to be intended to use the status stat all that much. Instead, what we might do is, so this weapon is already a fast fire rate, so we should still get some status procs, and we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to be sneaky because there is a mod called Hunter Munitions, which allows us to automatically get ourselves slash procs for dealing crit damage. So we're going to put that on there, which basically means that when we crit, we now have a good chance that we're going to put a slash proc on, which is direct damage to an enemy's health. And something that's quite cool that we can do with that is we can make it so that this does viral. Now, the reason that's important is because damage to health will be multiplied if we have a viral proc on there. So we're going to have a slash proc on there, which is going to do damage over time, which is going to do extra damage because we have viral on the weapon. Again, let me just fix the prime mod. I don't want to be using mods like that if we can help it. And then we're obviously going to get our multi-shot on there because that is always good. And we could opt for aptitude as well, but we really are not going to have all that many status on there. We'll be looking to have 2 or 3 on there when an enemy goes down. So we may opt to actually avoid galvanized aptitude in this case. This is where corrupted mods are going to come into it. So critical delay is gotten on Demos. Again, I have a video for this up on the channel, so if you guys need this, I would have a guide for how to get it. And this is actually going to slow down how fast we shoot, but it's going to give us a huge amount of crit chance. And then, of course, we're going to put on there Vital Sense. This, of course, is going to give us the big crit damage. From here, it's kind of up to us. We could speed the fire rate of the weapon back up, or you could do something like add in Hammer Shot to really hammer in that critical damage on there, because that is going to basically mean that that is 8 times this damage. So that's more like 2,400 times the 8% that we get from the multi-shot, thereby giving us pretty good stats on there. And again, let's get the arcane on. Just so that you guys are aware, there is a challenge when it comes to crit weapons, and that is that we can't stack crit as easily as we can stack status chance. For example, if I wanted to put point strike on here, even though I have enough space, it's not going to let me, because it's not going to let me overlap these 2 crit chance mods, which is a bit of a shame, because it means we only get to increase this once, which is why often when it comes to crit weapons, you're going to use this one instead of point strike, because we can only have 1 multiplier to the crit chance on there, and it's quite hard to get any more. And again, we've kind of been slammed shut from these more interesting status arcanes because we are not going to be doing many of these. There's a good chance that we might get a cold one off. So if I was to farm this could be pretty good because that's going to increase the crit damage and multi-shot by a lot. Primary frostbite could be good on here if you want to take off the infected clip and not do the viral damage. But for now, this is how I personally like to run this. And so let's go ahead and have a look at the Soma Prime. So as we'll see, this actually does really well. Soma Prime, still one of my favorite weapons. If you are going to mod for a crit weapon, I feel like it's very worth knowing that you have a greater chance of critting on the head. So if we fire at the head, you'll find that they're almost always a crit. That 10% no crit damage, 0 crit chance, should I say, is effectively never going to happen. Now we are going to talk about things outside of your weapon that can affect the way that your weapon damage happens and how you might want to continue filling out the loadout that you're packing when you go into a mission. There are two main things that I think most people will benefit from. We'll talk about reducing enemies' defenses in Steel Path a little bit later. Ideally, we want to look at either a damage boost or a vulnerability debuff. This is why I'm using my Nova, because I've also done something a bit cheeky. We have Nourish on here. Some abilities are going to add additional damage to what it is that you're doing. So in this case, Nourish is actually going to add 50% extra viral damage to my weapon, which means if I could just shoot this guy a couple of times just to get some base numbers on there, you'll see 1600s. Pop this on there, this will actually be a little bit higher. Obviously, there's going to be some defense calculations going on there, making it so that the damage isn't exactly going to be 50%. But you can see that if I have Nourish on, I'm going to be doing more damage. And additionally with Nova, we also have the Molecular Prime, which gives 100% damage vulnerability, which means not only can I add 50% damage to my weapon, I can then make it so that my total damage after that is going to get doubled with the Molecular Prime. This is why I like Nova so much. Nova's just really good. No Star makes you tanky. You stick a damage bonus on there, and then we can send in a Molecular Prime. And now numbers are going to like this. For some great overall damage numbers. Now, this is all great if you are in standard star chart. Once you reach Steel Path, you're going to have to worry about stripping enemies of their defenses. So if I do these same enemies, but in Steel Path, and I don't know what the minimum enemy level is for Steel Path, but let's just go with whatever it lets me have the max be. If I now go and do the same thing to these guys, we'll find that it's not quite as easy. Still pretty simple because these guys have only got shields. They don't have armor on, but not as easy as it could be. And this is going to be especially true of Grenier with their big heavy armor on. So if we go and do these big heavy gunners over here, you can see that it takes quite a few shots for us to deal with them, which isn't really ideal. And that's because of the shield that you can see over on the right hand side of their health bars. That is their armor rating, and we need a way to get rid of this. And generally speaking, there are two main ways. You can either get rid of it with your Warframe. You can in fact use something like your aura. There is corrosive projection if you want to get rid of some of it, but it's not going to get rid of all of it. You can use an ability. So if we take Hildren here, for example, we actually have Pillage, which takes a huge chunk of that armor away. So if we go over here, we go do a Pillage, we'll see most of it just disappears for us. And now getting rid of them is much easier. And the last way that we can do this is by using status effects. You'll hear some people talk about priming, and what this means is having a weapon that has high status, so you can see just how much we can stack the status rates up on this, and then you basically want to have corrosive and heat on the weapon. As much as possible of both. You can have some other stuff on there as well, but the idea is that we're going to go ahead, we're going to send some attacks down, and you can see that corrosive here can allow us to take up to 80% of the armor off the target. Someone's going to talk about Archon shards, but because they're time gated, I didn't really want to include those in the video. And heat can also take up 50% on its own as well, which means between the two, as long as we're proccing lots of heat and corrosive status on an enemy, we can actually drain their shield by using this as well. If I didn't have Pillage on Hildren for some reason, because I'd helmeted over it because I was mad, I could go ahead, I could get my epitaph out, I could drop some bombs, see all the armor's gone, and then quickly switch to my weapon so that we can do the required damage. Now, of course, I'm not exactly using the entire kit here. I'm just kind of showing you guys how I can get rid of an enemy's defenses. Now, most abilities that strip armor also strip shields. So if I go and do this to the corpus, it's going to be the exact same story. So I can come over here, take all the shields off, and have some good fun just deleting all of these. But that is ultimately what you're going to want to have in a loadout. When it comes to setting up a loadout, you should think about what it needs to have in it. It's going to need to have, as a checklist, a way to defend itself. Hildren's is actually a 2-for-1 because that Pillage rebuilds Hildren's shields. So that basically gives us renewable defense and takes off enemy defenses as well. All Hildren needs is some kind of power up to make its damage higher, which is why I put Raw on there. Whereas when it comes to Nova, Nova's only real weakness is that there's no direct shield stripping, even though we have the damage vulnerability and we have a low amount of energy economy. So I like to have Nourish on there, and then we just run something that can deal with armor effectively. And currently my favorite weapon for this is the Kuva Lich, which is just crazy. So when it comes to secondaries, we have secondary Innovate. Now this is one of those instances I was talking about before, where sometimes there are weapons that have a low crit chance but a really high crit damage. Now, right at the very end of the game with the Hex R, we can actually get an Arcane that synergizes with that very nicely. So on hit, I get to keep on increasing it by 10%, and that only resets after we've had big crits, which is the big red ones, which basically makes the Kuva Lich disgusting because we can times our damage by 12 every now and then. The best damage on this is just madness. So with someone like Nova and an armor stripping weapon, things like this, they just can't even stand in here. They can't even stand around here. You should aim to try and get some of the prime mods when Katia arrives. The last thing that I need to mention is Companions, because they are also part of your loadout, especially now. There are a lot of them that I could talk about, but I don't want to spend forever on this. So, and I'm much more of a, give you guys the tools to go mess around and experiment, because there's so much cool stuff. I doubt any one person knows every single combination that can be done with all of this, but I've been having great fun with Nautilus, with its cordon, because this basically just pulls enemies towards me, and we can have it so that when it uses one of its abilities, it gets to proc all of its status off of its own weapon, which means like I can have effectively anything equipped, but let's go with the Nucor here. It's going to pull everything in, and then we can just go ahead and delete everything because it's already full of status. And the funny thing is, because of the bond mod, as we defeat enemies with status, it reduces its cooldown, so you can effectively eternally keep on pulling enemies into you whilst you are destroying them. This is only one idea for a companion. You guys should keep an eye out for the ones that you like the most, so that you can just keep on building up the loadouts that you have. And like I say, remember to use the loadouts tab. I know I'm terrible at it, so that you can actually make properly planned out loadouts that have all of the tools that you're going to need to the damage, especially for the later game challenges. But that is ultimately how you make sure you're doing the most damage from beginning to end.